For many centuries, London was a dangerous place. It was a magnet for the very worst kind of people. Jack the Ripper dominated the headlines. But he wasn't the only killer around. Murder was afoot. The fear of death was everywhere. But police had their work cut out to track the culprits down. In this series, we'll be investigating some of the country's most notorious and intriguing crimes.
The female defendant.
Sexual intrigue, vicious murder, as well as the latest technology, fed the nation's insatiable desire for gruesome stories of London's dark side. On the morning of the 13th of July, 1955, Ruth Ellis was readied for execution in the condemned cell at Holloway Prison. She dressed in her own clothes, ate a small breakfast under the supervision of her female guards, and counted down the few minutes remaining before 9 a.m.
There was outrage at the execution. There were a lot of persons who didn't agree with it.
Thousands of people signed a petition asking and begging for Ruth Ellis to be reprieved.
There were lots of people who wrote personally to the Home Secretary expressing their feelings about the case.
The judge himself wrote to the Home Secretary saying that he should consider giving a reprieve.
The public, generally speaking, did not like to see women being executed.
There were some people who thought she got what she deserved and that she was a cold-blooded killer.
Ruth Ellis was at the forefront of public consciousness, and petitions to halt her execution had been organized by passionate members of the public. They took it upon themselves to gain as many signatures as possible in the hope that the Home Secretary would grant a reprieve. Many were still out on the morning of the execution, tirelessly collecting signatures. For in their eyes, the justice system which had served the country for centuries was not fit for this modern era.
Hello, sir. Would you like to sign this petition? Hello. Would you like to sign this petition? It's for Ruth Ellis. Hello, sir. Sign the petition for Ruth Ellis. Hello. Would you like to sign this petition? Hello, sir. Would you like to sign this petition? It's against the hanging of Ruth Ellis. Hello, ladies. Did you know that Ruth Ellis actually had a 10-year-old boy? Hello, sir. Sign the petition for Ruth Ellis.
Ticket, please, sir.
I do apologise, I've only just bought it.
That's quite all right, sir. We're running late anyway.
Oh, really?
Signal failure. We may be here for some time, sir.
Oh. Well. I never put it in there.
Always losing things in pockets myself. Thank you, sir.
It's one of those mornings for all of us, it seems.
At least we know someone's having a worse day. Tickets, please.
Hello, Mum. Are you against hanging? Hello, sir. Sign the petition for Ruth Ellis. Sign the petition.
Sorry?
The petition for Ruth Ellis.
It's a little late, isn't it? She'll be hanged in 15 minutes.
Yeah, but it's to tell the government how people feel.
Sorry.
What's being done to her is a disgrace. Tell me why you and everyone else on this train thinks it's all right to hang a 28-year-old mum.
Well, Mrs. Ellis had a fair trial. And she was convicted of murder by the jury, and we hang murderers in this country. The law couldn't be clearer.
Her son is 10 years old.
And I sympathise with him.
And yet you'd still send his mum to be hanged.
You may not like it, but the law is the law. We're all born equal under it.
Do you even know where she was born?
No, I don't. But I imagine it would be better for all concerned if she'd stayed there.
Ruth was born on the 9th of October 1926 in Rhyl, a working-class seaside town in North Wales. Ruth's mother was a Belgian refugee and her father played in the orchestras on Atlantic cruises. Hers was a traditional Catholic upbringing. But the stable family home Ruth was born into soon unraveled. Ruth's uncle was killed in a car crash in 1928, and her baby brother tragically died the following year. Her father numbed his grief with alcohol. He became a violent and abusive drunk. Unable to hold down a job, he uprooted the family again and again. Finally, in 1940, they moved to London.
These were the war years, so the move seemed somewhat surprising, but nonetheless it happened.
By 1944, he managed to get a job as a chauffeur in Southwark. He was lucky enough to get a flat that came with the job, so that's why they moved up there.
The teenage Ruth threw herself into London life. She didn't let the Blitz hold her back. She delighted in visiting cafes and dancing in nightclubs until the early hours. In 1943, she met a Canadian soldier called Claire Andrea McCallum and fell in love. She soon became pregnant, and McCallum asked her to marry him. Ruth began excited preparations for the wedding and their new life with the baby. What Ruth didn't know was that McCallum already had a wife and 3 children back home in Quebec. Soon after the war ended, with their son not yet 9 months old, she discovered the truth. Ruth was heartbroken. She swore she would never let another man hurt her like that again. But life for a single mother in post-war London was not easy. Jobs were scarce, and rationing was still brutal. Ruth could not afford to be picky. She responded to an advert for evening work as a model at the Camera Club near Bond Street. It was through the Camera Club that she met Maurice Conley. He posed as a respectable businessman, but was in fact the biggest vice boss in the city. He invited Ruth to become a hostess at one of his nightclubs.
London in those days was full of nightclubs. The pubs had a very strict closing times, and so nightclubs catered for the late night drinking clients. And of course it was also linked with the sex trade as well. There would be all sorts of types who would be visiting those clubs, so you never quite knew who you were dealing with.
Their clientele certainly included a lot of men who were very privileged, who were sort of upper middle class, upper class, and frequented these clubs as part of their leisure time and enjoyment.
The club owner, he actually encouraged it and encouraged relationships with the customers. This was a way of bringing more money. So there was a lot of money floating around.
Her duties at the club were simple. Look pretty, entertain guests, and have sex with whoever Connolly told her to, including himself.
So she was a good time girl.
It was the work she could get.
There was no shop or factory that would take her.
What is it you do?
I work in insurance.
And how'd you get that job then?
Well, after leaving university, this was before the war, there was a connection I had with the firm.
Let me guess. A friend of your father's. Ruth's dad was an unemployable drunk.
I recognized that I was fortunate. But were there really no alternatives for her?
She tried to live respectfully. Even married a fella. For all the good it did her.
And that was Mr. Ellis, I presume?
Yeah. He was a drunk and all. And a dentist. Even worse.
So what became of him? Why didn't it last?
He bashed her about. She left.
By 1953, Ruth had a new name and a new daughter. Both were courtesy of a failed marriage to a drunk. It was in this year, too, that she first dyed her hair that famous platinum blonde. She was now Ruth Ellis, the woman who would grace 1,000 front pages. In August 1953, Ruth Ellis became manager of the Little Club in Knightsbridge. It was another Maurice Connolly establishment. But Ruth was proud that at 26 years old, she was the youngest club manager in London. After a series of false starts and false hopes, Ruth's life finally seemed on track. The first customer through the door was a lean and handsome young man. He was an aspiring race car driver with the family money to match his looks. His name was David Blakely. Within 2 years, David would be dead, and Ruth would be awaiting execution in Holloway Prison for his murder.
There's a telephone. Inside. In case they change their minds, right?
Yeah, I'm certain there will be, yes. She seems quite reconciled to it, I read. As far as one can tell.
Said she wants to be together again.
With?
Yeah. With him.
Ruth Ellis started an affair with David Blakely, and I think initially they were actually sort of besotted with one another.
David Blakely was a young man who was from quite a privileged social background, more privileged than Ruth Ellis's background, from a higher social class, and obviously within the context of the time that would have been perceived as quite significant.
Ellis falls for him in a big, big way. Blakely moves in with her. It was a club lifestyle. It was drinks, it was parties. There's this tremendous sense of liberation and sort of, you can do anything. There was a certain freedom about. Domesticity was not something that was normally considered.
They enthusiastically fell in love with each other, but it wasn't long before they were each having affairs.
They were both jealous people. David still pursued other women, and Ruth was the center of attention at her club. But if their similarities caused arguments, so did the couple's differences. They came from different social worlds. David had no qualms in taking Ruth to bed, but he did not dare introduce her to his mother. And Ruth felt looked down upon by David's friends. For they were used to a social circle of the same class of people, and openly mocked the working-class girl from North Wales.
They shouldn't have been rude to her. There's no excuse for that. But I can understand if there were suspicions. Someone like him with someone like...
What? Someone like me?
They came from very different backgrounds.
So she was just some poor tart.
I didn't say that. But people were bound to wonder why they were together. Do you not believe there's the slightest possibility of some ulterior motive on her behalf?
You think she was just after his money?
Well, is it so far-fetched?
What about Desmond Cousin?
Oh, the other chap.
He was rich, he wanted to marry her. So why didn't she just go off with him if that was what she wanted?
Ruth had, in fact, met Desmond Cusson before Blakely. Cusson was on the fringes of the racing set who stalked the little club. The 30-year-old was shy, well-mannered, and utterly in love with Ruth. He longed to break her away from David and marry her himself.
Desmond Cusson was born and brought up in Leatherhead in Surrey. He was a rich, unassuming accountant, and he was a director of a firm of tobacconists.
Blakely encourages a relationship with Cousin, who was an ex-Lancaster pilot, and his family were in the cigarettes and retail distribution, so he had quite a bit of money. But although Ellis is willing to have an affair and become Cousin's mistress, she is still very much in love with Blakely.
By late 1954, Ruth and David's relationship had turned ugly. David soaked all his money and efforts into racing. He increasingly relied on Ruth for financial support. She gave him drinks at the little club and allowed him to stay in her flat free of charge.
I think when young women at her age found themselves in London, it was sometimes quite difficult for them to make their own way unless they had attached themselves to a respecter or a man who would give them a proper home.
One of the things that's perhaps worth remembering about Ruth is that because she had become a mother when she wasn't married and when she was young, that automatically, in the context of the time we're talking about, made life quite difficult for women. They did run the risk of losing their job if it was known that they'd had the child out of marriage. So there were a variety of other types of employment that they might need to engage in.
She definitely liked the glamour, and she loved the fast cars and mixing with rich people and the aristocracy. And during that time, she clearly felt that people appreciated her, and she was beginning to feel like a somebody.
This passionate affair would soon sour, as occasional acts of domestic violence by Blakely would become routine. The uglier and more abusive the relationship became, however, the harder it seemed for either to break free. They loved and hated one another. Their bitter arguments and passionate reconciliations swallowed up their whole lives. It destroyed Ruth's success at the little club too. Customers were put off by the couple's constant public rows. Takings more than halved, infuriating the owner, Maurice Conley. In December 1954, Ruth lost her job and the flat that came with it. Homeless and jobless, she moved in temporarily with Desmond Cusson, but still she did not give up on David. The relationship continued, and so did the violence. Early in 1955, Ruth began French lessons in an attempt to impress David and his upper-class friends. The tutor later recalled her students' black eyes and bruised limbs. Ruth, she thought, was a woman on the verge of a breakdown.
I can't help questioning her taste in men.
Well, no argument there.
What I don't understand, though, is if it was as bad as you imply, with the violence and unpleasantness, the misery, why did she stay?
It's not as simple as that.
Could you not just leave him? Cut him off? Never see him again?
When you know something's bad, getting away from it can seem even worse. Anyway, she couldn't. He wouldn't let her. Blakely said if she left, he'd kill her. And I reckon he would as well.
It would be Ellis, however, who would end up awaiting execution for murder. Her 2 children would be left without a mother, and all the hopes and dreams she worked towards would be destroyed. The difficult life which Ruth tried to overcome would eventually catch up with her, and all she could do is sit and wait for the inevitable end. By early 1955, the alcohol-fueled affair between Ruth Ellis and David Blakely had turned violent. The relationship had cost the 28-year-old woman her job and her home. Ruth's future with David looked grim, but she could imagine no other. In February, she left the home of her friend Desmond Cusson with her 10-year-old son and moved to a small bedsit in Kensington. She hoped David would join her there. Ruth began her new life in Egerton Gardens, and Blakely would from time to time stay, but with him came the arguments and violence. In an attempt to help Ruth, Cusson lent her money to attend a modelling course in central London. But this attempt to restart her life was soon derailed. Ruth found out she was pregnant. David was the father, but it did nothing to change the course of their relationship.
She then moved in with Desmond Cusson at Goodwood Court in his flat there. And from time to time, she did a bit of modelling with the Cherry Marshall School of Modelling. Not terribly successfully. I can remember reading a book by Cherry Marshall saying that whenever Ruth Ellis turned up, she'd got bruises all over her body.
During another drunken argument, David punched Ruth in the stomach. She lost the baby. The miscarriage made Ruth ill. As Easter approached, she was confined to bed with a fever and deeply depressed. At this stage, David's friends, Ant and Carol Findlater, decided to intervene. They'd always disliked Ruth and long urged David to end his romance with the lower-class girl. Now they resolved to keep the couple apart over the long Easter weekend.
At about 10 o'clock in the morning, on Good Friday, Blakely left their serviced room in Egerton Gardens, telling Ruth that he would be back later in the day. He didn't come back.
Blakely had gone out with some friends, and she thought that he was perhaps romantically involved with one of these friends, and she was unhappy about this. She actually herself spent the weekend with Desmond Cusson. They're both sort of spending time together, drinking quite heavily together.
In the early hours of Easter Sunday, she returned home to the tiny bedsit in Kensington. She sat in the darkness by her sleeping son and thought about her life, about her drunk and violent father, her drunk and violent husband, and her drunk and violent boyfriend. It was then that a new and peculiar feeling took hold of her. She realized she wanted to kill David.
Ruth spent a lot of time with Desmond Cousin, and it would seem that he was winding her up like a corkscrew.
It's in this point that he gives her a gun. He shows her how to shoot. And you've got to look at Cousin's motive for this. Is it a way of eliminating the rival and punishing the girl?
That evening on Easter Sunday, Ruth took her son home to Kensington. She tucked him up in bed before changing. She then kissed the boy goodnight and, telling him she wouldn't be long, slipped out of the flat. Her son would never see Ruth again. Ruth left her bedsit and travelled to Tanser Road in Hampstead, where she believed Blakely would be. The Findlaters were hosting another party that night, but by 9 p.m, they were running low on cigarettes. David volunteered to visit the Magdala pub by Hampstead Heath Station and fetch some. He could buy more drink while he was there too. Another partygoer, Clive Gunnell, accompanied him. The pair left in David's car for the short drive.
She watched the house. She saw David come out with his friend Gunnell, get in a car and drive away. Now the thing is that between Tanser Road, where she was, and the Magdala, where David was going to, it was a little bit of a drive. So she couldn't really have had any knowledge of where they were going. They could have been going anywhere. But when she walked back down the road, presumably she saw his car parked outside the Magdala.
Ruth lurked in the street, pacing up and down outside the pub, waiting for David to emerge. She didn't have to wait long. At 9:20 p.m, David and Clive exited the pub. David stepped over to his car, groping for his keys with 3 large bottles of beer clutched to his chest.
She fired 6 shots. 4 of them hit him directly and killed him. 1 of them missed. 1 of them ricocheted and hit a passerby.
Blakely starts running. She goes after him, fires again, he falls down. And then she stands over him and empties the gun into his back.
Ruth stepped away from the body and raised the gun to her temple. She could not pull the trigger. She lowered the revolver and fired the last round off into the pavement. Then she turned to Clive Gunnell and told him to call the police. Ruth's arrest was inevitable. An off-duty police constable, Alan Thompson, was sat in the corner of the Magdala pub when the shooting started. He pushed his way through the crowd of witnesses. Outside, he found Ruth Ellis standing over the body of her lover, David Blakely. The gun was still in her hand. Beer bottles lay shattered all around. The glass shone wet with beer and blood. Gently, the policeman took the gun away from Ruth. She did not resist. And at no point did she deny her involvement. On Easter Monday, Ruth was charged with David's murder. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, she told a policewoman. I will hang for this.
Was it the idea of parting from him that she couldn't bear?
She loved him. And he took everything from her. Then laughed about it with his mates.
But for all her unhappiness, which I recognise was considerable, this was no act of sudden passion.
Oh, she Suffered abuse for years.
And had time to think. Which is my point. She took a gun and she followed Blakely. First to the house, then to this pub. And she waited for him there. For how long? 10 minutes? Longer? She chose to kill him. To stand closer than you and I are now and empty her gun into him.
During the Easter weekend of 1955, Ruth Ellis's life had reached breaking point. Her lover, David Blakely, had disappeared with friends, and she spent the weekend drinking with her ex-lover, Desmond Cusson. She was certain that Blakely was having an affair, and fueled by jealousy and drink, she sought him out, armed with a gun provided by Cusson. She shot Blakely multiple times and was arrested shortly after. Ruth knew her actions that fateful night would ultimately lead to her execution. Her certainty may have been misplaced. 2 decades earlier, a woman was put on trial for a similar crime. In 1932, Elvira Barney, a London socialite, was tried for the murder of her boyfriend. After a loud argument in which Elvira threatened to shoot him, he was found dead with a gunshot wound to the chest. Elvira insisted it was an accident. She was threatening suicide, she said, and her boyfriend tried to stop her. During a tussle over the weapon, the gun accidentally discharged and delivered the fatal injury. The jury believed her. She was found not guilty. Soon after the verdict, Elvira was back on the dance floor at her favorite Café de Paris in central London. "Take a good look at me," she exclaimed to the crowds. "I'm the one who shot her lover." Like Ruth, Elvira was only in her 20s. Like Ruth, she was a fixture of London nightlife. And, like Ruth, she had a tempestuous, alcohol-fueled relationship with the man killed. But unlike Ruth, Elvira was a wealthy member of the social elite. What would the court in public make of a working-class girl like Ruth? Her trial began at the Old Bailey on the 20th of June, 1955.
When she went to court, there was tremendous hostility towards her, the good time girl, the tart. And she is subjected to one of the most devastating cross-examinations ever. Prosecuting counsel asked her one question. It's unique, just one question. When you stood over the body of David Blakely and fired into his body, what did you intend to do? I intended to kill him. Counsel sat down. You've got the guilty intent, you've got the physical act. You don't have to prove anything more, and that is murder.
Whether it means that she wanted to be found guilty, I think, is a difficult question to answer, but she said it was obvious that she'd intended to kill him. She said this in court. And I think it shows that she was answering very honestly. Of course, that doesn't necessarily benefit you if you're on trial for murder, but she was certainly willing to give honest answers to the questions, and some of those perhaps meant that she was then perceived, certainly in relation to the criminal justice system and the legal process, quite negatively.
I don't think she had any doubts in her mind that she had intended to kill. And my guess is that in her own mind, she was justified in killing him because of the way that she perceived that he had been treating her. So I don't think that she was in any way looking to be regarded as innocent of the act of shooting him.
By then, a fiction had been presented in the press. David as the well-educated son of privilege, led astray by the peroxide blonde charms of the social climbing lower class. David's own violence and jealousy were ignored. Ruth's defense did little to correct these misconceptions. Prosecution witnesses were barely cross-examined, and Ruth's barristers seemed squeamish about revealing David's true nature. Instead, they depicted the murder as an act of typical female hysteria.
Men don't get called hysterical.
Well, not as a rule, no. But we are perhaps less prone to the... I mean...
How was David Blakely not hysterical when he was waiting in her club all evening, picking fights with any man that even looked at her? How was George Ellis not hysterical? Calling her 10 times a day after she left. What's the difference? Because they were men? Oh no, it's a woman. She must be jealous or hysterical. Women can't control themselves when they're jealous. Her defence said that. They didn't even look into that gun. Never even asked her how she got it or who taught her how to use it. And the fact that she was hospitalised from the beatings that he gave her, she lost a baby. And she was sick for weeks and the jury heard none of it.
Mrs. Ellis may have been better off with you as an advocate.
Couldn't have been worse. They were looking out for their own. They didn't want to know what decent boy Blakely was really like.
The mystery of how she obtained the freshly oiled and loaded gun was left unexplored. The prolonged physical abuse she suffered was not made clear to the jury, and there was little effort to explain her complex emotions on the night of the murder.
They'd made no effort to discredit the prosecution case and would subject the witnesses of the prosecution to a minimum of cross-examination. It's obvious that evidence about the gun was nowhere near detailed enough for any balanced jury to convict upon. And any competent lawyer would have played on the fact that the ballistics had not been carried out on the gun. Too many crucial questions were left unasked.
There's always a temptation to think, well, could her trial have been done differently? But the defence get one go at it, and they have to decide how to work their defence. But of course, that first question asked by the prosecuting counsel, why did you do it? She said, I wanted to kill him, and she did. So really, she was convicted because of what she herself had said at her trial, quite voluntarily.
After less than half an hour's deliberation, the jury found Ruth guilty. She was sentenced to death. In 1955, however, opposition to the death penalty in Britain was growing. A royal commission had already investigated the practice and concluded it offered little deterrent to crime. Prominent miscarriages of justice had shocked the nation, and even those in favour of capital punishment often hesitated at the thought of executing a woman. A campaign for clemency was launched on Ruth's behalf. Petitions urging a reprieve gained thousands of signatures around the world. But Ruth herself had no desire to escape execution. She just wanted to be with David again. The Home Secretary, too, saw no reason for the law not to take its course. There would be no reprieve.
I'm sorry.
Sign the petition.
We should be moving off very shortly, sir.
Sign it.
Is this young lady bothering you, sir?
No, not at all. Thank you.
Do you have a ticket, miss?
Yeah, it's here.
Can you step this way, please?
I have it.
You've been bothering this gentleman quite enough.
I have it.
Excuse me. It's here. It's on your clipboard.
Be more careful in future, miss. Sir?
Thank you.
Hand me the petition.
Thanks.
Ruth's death strengthened public opinion against the death penalty. Within a decade, the practice would end in Great Britain. The prejudices of sex and class that helped send Ruth to the gallows, however, would prove far more stubborn.